Welcome everyone to the second session of Mishnah in-depth Keritot with Rabbi David Silber. This class is part of Drisha's Rifka Rosenwein Mishnah Division, sponsored in her memory. This ongoing series is following the Mishnah Yomit schedule, where you will be learning 1 to 2 mishnayot each day independently and come together for a shiur once a week. For this Masechet, we have the pleasure of learning with Rabbi David Silber, the dean and founder of Drisha.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we started with Mishnah Keritot. We started with the beginning. And just to review again, get a sense of what this tractate is about. The tractate has 6 chapters. It begins with a list of Keritot, that is, sins for which the punishment in the Torah is karet. The Mishnah says there is 36 such sins. When the Rambam lists them, by the way, in his Hilchot Shkagot, that's the section of the Rambam that deals with inadvertent sin. He has 43. That's a detail. It's really not a significant difference. The Rambam has some additional cases that the Talmud speaks of. The Mishnah has 36. But as I mentioned last week in the very beginning, the tractate is not about karet. That's not really the subject of the tractate. The tractate is about, fundamentally, what the Rambam calls in his Mishnah Torah, Hilchot Shkagot, inadvertent sin. That's basically, in the bigger sense, that's what these 6 chapters are about. And of course, within these 6 chapters, there are specific foci, I would say, that in these 3 classes we have together, I'm trying to highlight them and to point them out. And the first point is that in the chapter 1, after it lists these various Keritot, in the second Mishnah, it says, Al Elu Chayavim Al Zdonam Karet, V'al Shigatam Chatat, V'al Lo Hovda Shelahen Asham Talui. Chutna Metamei Mikdash V'Chadashav, Mipnei Shu Bo Levi Yorei, Divrei Rabbi Meir. V'Chachamim Armim Afa Megadef. So the Mishnah says that all those listed in the first Mishnah, for which there is a chiyuv of karet, punishment being karet, if one did them unwittingly, then there is the obligation to bring in asham talui. Asham is a different sacrifice. There's a sacrifice called the chatat, a sin offering. Then there's another sacrifice that sounds very much like it called an asham. And according to the Mishnah, if one sins inadvertently, one sins inadvertently, but one is not sure that one actually sinned at all. One has a safek, a doubt. Then one brings called an asham talui, kind of contingent asham. And later in the last chapter, we'll look at that in a little while, it talks about what if you find out that actually you did sin. Then in that case, you bring the chatat offering. What if you find out that you didn't sin? Then that's the discussion in the last chapter of this tractate, and maybe we'll get to that as well. So that's called an asham talui. So in other words, you're not sure whether or not you sinned, called safek, a doubt. And that, I think, is one of the core issues that this tractate deals with. There's inadvertent sin, and then there's situations of safek. There's something called an asham talui, which is a very interesting sacrifice, which I wanted to focus on. But before we get to that, I wanted to point out something in general about these sacrifices that are brought in cases of inadvertent sin. I'm not getting now into the question of what does inadvertent mean. We discussed it a bit last week, and we pointed out the case in the Mishnah, later on in the mishnayot, talks about a situation where, for example, there were 2 pieces of meat. One is certainly kosher, one is certainly not kosher. By not kosher, I mean, let's say this chaylev, because most of these sins, averot, are not sins for which there is the punishment of karet. Most of them, apart from the 36 or 43, there are punishment. The default punishment of the Talmud is called malkot, flagellation. So that's not actually in the Torah itself. It mentions only in one place, but that's the default in rabbinic thinking in the Mishnah. That's called malkot. There are certain things for which you are there's a shiur of an obligation, a punishment of karet, and of the foods that one may not eat. Food typically is not karet, with the exceptions. The main exceptions are two, which are chelev and dam, certain fats of the animal and blood, both of which are essential to the sacrificial order. Sacrifices. One throws the blood, one burns the chelev. Those things that are put on the altar are forbidden to eat, for the individual to eat, and there we have the shiur of karet. So the Mishnah, though, so we know of a chatat, we know of an asham. Now, where do we have this? So chatat is mentioned in the 4th chapter of Vayikra. It talks about in nefesh achat techata bishgaga, which is chapter 4, verse number 27. And one sinned inadvertently, then one brings a sacrifice called a chatat sacrifice. Okay. Then, when you get to chapter 5, chapter 4 is other situations, special cases of chatat. And then we come to Vayikra chapter 5. In Vayikra chapter 5, begins with the pasuk, "V'nefesh ki techeta v'shama kol Allah, v'hu'ed o ra'a o yada, im lo yagid v'nasa avono." So the first case in chapter 5 is, and I'll read the translation of JPS, when one has heard a public heresy imprecation. In other words, an Allah, and it means someone is imposing upon you an oath, and the point of it is that you know testimony. The claim is that you can testify in such a way that I will win. Let's say I'll win money. I'll win the case. You are obligated to testify. Failure to testify, v'nasa avono, is a sin. You bear the sin. Now the point is that the Mishnah refers to this case as shvuat ha'edut. So the witness who the oath was imposed upon the witness, and the witness, in a sense, is guilty of the guilt is of not testifying, and in that case, that's case number 1 in chapter 5. The second case in chapter 5 is nefesh asher tiga b'chol davar tamei. If someone came in contact with something that makes that person tamei, whether it's a dead animal, etc., sherets, certain kinds of rodents, essentially, that's forbidden, that if you touch them, you are tamei. Who tamei v'yashem, that person is guilty, and guilty. He is ritually impure and bears guilt. So that's the second case. And the third case is nefesh ki tishava levate b'svatayim lohara o lehetiv. Someone took an oath and failed to keep the oath, violated the oath that someone had taken. That's called shvuat bitui. You pronounced an oath and violated it. In all of these cases, says the Mishnah, then you are ashamed, you are guilty. In verse number 5, if you bear guilt for one of these 3 sins, you confess the sin, you admit that you're guilty. That person brings ashamot, the guilt offering, but it's not an asham. It's actually a korban chatat. And the animal that's brought, nikeva minatzon kispa o sirati zimu chatat. Then you bring a sin offering. The sin offering is a female from the flock, sheep or goat. Sin offerings are female. Chatat is female. So these are 3 cases where you bring a korban chatat. But what is unusual about these 3 cases is what come next in the Torah. And the Mishnah will, of course, refer to this. We'll get to the Mishnah shortly. The Mishnah says, what about if you can afford to bring this sacrifice? Because you're talking about a sheep or a goat. Maybe you don't have the money. Maybe it's a poor person. So in that case, the Torah says you could bring, instead of the goat or the sheep, you can bring in chapter 5, in verse number 7, they say you can't afford it. Then you can bring two birds, two doves, either doves, in the Tractate, turtle doves or pigeons. You bring two of them, not one. One is a chatat, and one is an olah. So this is a paired sacrifice, in place of the goat or the sheep. It's less expensive. What about if you can't afford that? What about if you can't afford even that? You're really very poor. Then in verse number 11, you can't afford the birds. Then you can bring a flour offering, known elsewhere as a mincha. It's a mincha, it's a flour offering in the case of sin, where you couldn't afford to pay either for the sheep and not even for the birds. These are three cases. And the term that is found in the Mishnah is a korban oleh v'yored. Oleh v'yored. Oleh means you can afford it, more expensive, or less expensive. And in these three cases, there is also three options. There's the regular normal sacrifice of the goat or the sheep. If you can't afford that, the two birds. If you can't afford that, the flour offering, the mincha. That's known in the Talmud as dalut and dalei dalut, the poor person and the very poor person. These are three cases. Now, what's unusual about these cases, let me make two points about these cases. The second case is very interesting. When you read the Torah, this is a general statement about the entire Mishnah, about the entire Talmud. When you read the Torah, it sounds like that the sin is becoming tameh, is becoming ritually impure. Or perhaps we would formulate it as the sin is remaining impure. There are ways to rid oneself of impurity. So it's not your fault if you touch the dead animal by accident. You can't be blamed for that, but you should bathe in the ritual bath in the mikveh and remove the impurity. What it sounds like is that the sin is remaining in a state of impurity. That is not the rabbinic position in the Talmud at all. The rabbinic position, which is already found in the Mishnah, is that the case is not, the problem is not remaining in a state of tumah. In the Talmud, there is no such thing as a sin of becoming tameh. It's probably not a good state to be in, but it's not in itself a crime. The problem the Talmud suggests, the Mishnah suggests, is that in the state of impurity, you either came and touched something sacred, sacrifice, for example. That is to say, sacrifice having been slaughtered, sacrificial meat, sacrificial food, or you walked into the sacred place in a state of impurity. That's called mitamei mikdash v'kadashav, or tumat mikdash v'kadashav. These are three cases. Let's look how the Mishnah formulates this korban oleh v'yored. This is Tractate Keritot. Let's find the Mishnah. It's chapter 2, Mishnah number 3. Perek Bet, Mishnah Gimel. I'll read it. Chamisha miviyin korban echad al averot harbei, v'chamisha miviyim korban oleh v'yored. So the Mishnah has two different rules over here. The first is not our topic right now. Maybe next session we'll discuss this. There are 5 who can bring one sacrifice for multiple sins. And there are 5 who bring korban oleh v'yored. That's the sacrifice we're talking about. So oleh v'yored is a korban chatat. It's a chatat. It's a sin offering called the chatat. But you can bring, if you can't afford the normal chatat, you have 2 other options, either the 2 birds or the flour, the mincha. Now the Mishnah lists, but we always saw 3. So the Mishnah has 5. Let's see the 5. Later on, Mishnah, it's chapter 2. Yes, it's Mishnah 4. Sorry for that. Chapter 2, Mishnah 4. Elu meviyin korban oleh v'yored. Al shmiyat hakol, that we saw. That's the person who has testimony to give and fails to give it, was obligated through an oath to give it and failed to do that. Albito is fatayim. That's the person that took an oath to do or not do something. Al tumat mikdash v'kadashav, as I mentioned, one who in a state of tumah either ate sacrificial meat, sacrificial food, or entered into the temple. And then the Mishnah has two more cases. Hayoredet v'hamatzora. A woman who gives birth, this is described in Vayikra, later on in Vayikra. So there's a whole procedure. She is ritually impure, let's say, depending if she gives birth to a boy or girl, she's either ritually impure for 7 days, followed by 33 days, the Torah calls Yomei Torah, and for a girl it's 14 and 66. At the end of that period of time, for the woman who's given birth, at the end of the time for the Mitzora, who has some kind of Hansen's disease or some other kind of serious skin disease, there's a whole process of becoming ritually pure, ridding oneself of the tumah, including sacrifices that are brought. And there, the Torah says that if she, or in the case of the Mitzora, she or he, can't afford to bring one of the sacrifices, then there are alternate sacrifices one can bring. Now, in those two cases, by the way, there are not three options. There are only two options. So it's different. The first three cases, chapter 5, that's 3 options. The Yoledet and the Mitzora have only 2 options. But more than that, the main difference between them is that the first 3 are guilty of some kind of sin. Failure to testify, denial of knowledge of testimony, or failure to testify, false oaths, defiling the temple, defiling sacred food. But the Yoledet and Mitzora have done presumably nothing. It's not a sin offering. But for whatever reason, there are offerings at the end of the period, which of course supports the idea that the word chatat doesn't really mean sin. It means something else, some kind of cleansing. But it's not necessarily sin. In any event, these are the 5 cases the Mishnah lists as a korban olev yored. So olev yored is a korban chatat with options. But the Torah has something else. Apart from the korban chatat, there's a different sacrifice called an asham. And the asham sacrifice, that's found also in Vayikra. And that's also in chapter 5. And that's chapter 5, beginning in verse number 14. Nefesh ki timo mal v'chata b'shgaga mikodshei Hashem. So the first case, now I'm not getting into all the specifics of these cases, because the question is always, what does the Torah seem to say? And what is the rabbinic or the mishnaic, Talmudic understanding of it? Those are not necessarily the same thing. But the cases of asham in chapter 5 are first what's called me'ilah. There's a whole tractate called Tractate Me'ilah, which is a tractate after, by the way, Keritot. That is if trespassing, if one misuses either something which belongs to the temple or sacrificial things, that's called me'ilah. And there's a penalty. You have to, let's say if you took something worth money, you have to pay back the money. You have to add a fifth, a chomesh. Well, it ends up to be a quarter, but whatever. There's an additional monetary penalty. And you bring a korban asham. You bring in asham sacrifices. The first is me'ilah. Then the Mishnah has the next section, verse number 17. Nefesh ki techata v'yasta achat mikol mitzvot Hashem asher lo teyosena v'lo yoda v'yashem v'nosa avono. Chapter 5, verse 17. One has sinned and did not know. The Talmudic understanding of that is, did not know that one has sinned. In other words, the case that we discussed last time, called an asham talui, which is one of the main subjects of Tractate Keritot. We'll get to that shortly. That's case number 2. And then we have a third case. cases beginning in verse number 20 of chapter 5 of Vayikra. Nefesh ki techata umora mar b'Hashem v'kichesh b'amito b'pikadon or b'tzumet yad gezel or shake or shakat amito. In other words, I have someone's money. Maybe I stole something. Maybe it was given to me to watch, to guard. I'm a shomer, and I deny it, and I swore that I don't have it. In that case, that's known in the Mishnah as in Talmud as Shuvat Apikadon. That's an asham. So that's called asham gzelot. In other words, there's the asham of me'ilah, is the asham talui, and there is the asham gzela. I denied through an oath that I have it, and then I confessed. In which case, I have to restore the money plus a fifth, plus the korban asham. Now, there's a difference between the korban asham and the korban chatat. Actually, the Mishnah elsewhere, in the very beginning of Tractate Zvachim, which introduces the whole section of the Mishnah called Kodashim, that whole Seder, there's a dispute of Tanaim to what extent asham and chatat are really very, very similar. Rabbi Eliezer is of the opinion that fundamentally they're not that different. And the rabbis disagree. Again, not our topic right now. But we have here the asham. Now, there are other cases of asham, which are not over here. And that is, once again, situations where, not of sin necessarily, but where one brings an asham. And, for example, if someone took upon oneself to be a Nazir, a Nazirite, and then became ritually impure, either intentionally or unintentionally, there is one of the sacrifices that is brought is the asham sacrifice. So, once again, there's an asham which is related to sin or misdeed, and there's an asham which is not necessarily related to sin or misdeed at all, but brought for other reasons. So there are 5 such cases, and 3 of them, though, are clearly in Vayikra related to sin, and one of them is the asham talui. Now, there is another interesting detail about some of these offerings, and that's found in chapter 2, Mishnah number 2. Elu mivi'in al hazadon kishkaga, haba al hashifcha, nazir shenitma, shuat ha'edut, v'al shuat ha'pikadon. Chapter 2, Mishnah 2, very important Mishnah. There are some people who bring a sacrifice even when they sinned intentionally. Now, 4 are listed. Let's leave the first one out for the moment, because I wanted to focus on that. Maybe next session we'll focus on that. That's a very interesting case. The second case is Nazir Shenitzma, that I mentioned. Someone took a Nazirite vow, but became ritually impure. The Nazir is not allowed to become Tameh under any circumstance, or almost any circumstance. But the Nazir became Tameh either inadvertently or advertently or intentionally. In either event, in any event, there's a set of sacrifices that the Nazir brings, including a chatat and an asham. And even though it was done intentionally, the sacrifices are brought. And the last 2 are very interesting, Shvuat ha'edut and Shvuat ha'pikadon. Shvuat ha'edut, we saw, is the korban chatat, the olev yored. And the Mishnah says whether you intentionally did not testify, having the oath imposed upon you, you failed to testify intentionally, you would still bring a korban olev yored, and shvuat ha'pikadon, which we call asham gzelot. There's an asham sacrifice, as we saw, and there also I stole something, and you say give it back, and I deny having it intentionally, and then I admit. In such a case, I bring a korban asham. So these are cases where you bring a korban asham or a chatat even though it's not a shogeg, it is bizado. I left out the first case, which is the last case of asham, haba al shivcha, and we'll leave that out maybe till next time because that is a very interesting case. And what I'm trying to focus on over here in these sessions is what the Tractate Keritot, I think, is really what really interests them. And I would say beyond Tractate Keritot, I would say the Talmud in general. There tends to be a certain focus on certain kinds of cases. Maybe we'll talk more about that next time. But in the time we have, I wanted to focus on asham talui. And asham talui comes up and actually in the last chapter of this tractate in the most interesting way. This is chapter, Keritot has 6 chapters. Let's take a look at the mishnayot in the beginning of chapter 6. It says the following, Hamevi asham talui, v'nodalo shelo chatat. So the Mishnah begins with the following case. Remember, asham talui is brought, according to the Mishnah earlier, in a case where I might have sinned, but I'm not sure. There were 2 pieces of meat. I know I ate one of them, but I don't know whether, and one of them was certainly not kosher, I'm told, but I don't know which one I ate. So then I bring in asham talui. What happens, says the Mishnah, if I found out afterwards, someone says, the piece of meat you ate, that was kosher meat. That's kosher meat. I mean, because I checked the other one, it's not kosher. This one was kosher. Any kind of various scenarios. I know now that I didn't do anything wrong. I ate a piece of meat. That's fine. So here the Mishnah has 3 opinions. 3 opinions. What do you do in such a case? Rabbi Meir says, Imad shalom nishchat yeitzei v'yireh ba'eder. The animal is standing in my backyard. I haven't brought it yet as a sacrifice, says Rabbi Meir. So it was a mistake. So that animal is not hektish. When you bring a sacrifice, you designate the animal. That's called hektish. You're makdish. You designate the animal, and when you designate it, verbally designate it, it has a certain amount of sanctity to it. It's kadosh. But in this case, says Rabbi Meir, it was a mistake because I only did it on the provision that I actually sinned. But now I discover I didn't sin, and the animal wasn't brought yet as a sacrifice. So take the animal home and whatever. Let it join with the other animals. Nothing happens. Chachamim omrim, yira ad sheyistayev v'yimacher v'yiblu damav l'nedava. The Chachamim say no. Once you designated it, has a certain amount of sanctity. It's an asham. So what do you do with an asham that can't be brought as a sacrifice? Because you can only bring an asham if you're in fact guilty. In these cases, they're brought for guilt, but there is no guilt. I did nothing wrong. Say the Chachamim, let it go back to the, let it graze in the field until it gets a blemish. And when it gets a blemish, then you can redeem the animal. There's a concept called pidyon hegdish. You can redeem hegdish, but only if it has a blemish. You can't redeem animals that have no blemish. So this animal it has sanctity. The asham talui has sanctity, even though we know there was no sin. But it was designated as an asham talui, therefore it has sanctity. You can't just use it as you would any other animal. You have to wait till it gets a blemish, then you redeem it. And with that money, you bring a different sacrifice. You can bring a burnt offering, a shlamim. It's called a nedava. Nedava is a sacrifice you can bring, not imposed upon you. It's one you choose to bring. The asham and chatat, you only bring if you're in fact guilty. Phil did nothing wrong. But the chachamim say, nonetheless, the animal has sanctity. So this is interesting. I want to come back to this in a moment, but I want to read the 3rd opinion in the Mishnah, which is the most interesting, I think. The opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer Omer Yikarev. She'im eino ba al chet zeh, harehu ba al chet acher. Says Rabbi Eliezer, you can bring it. Why? You didn't sin. Says Rabbi Eliezer, you didn't sin on this. You may have sinned on something else. Now, I want to come back to what that means. You may have sinned on something else. Fact of the matter is, this view of Rabbi Eliezer in chapter 6, Mishnah number 1, is related, no doubt, to a Mishnah later on in chapter 6, which is chapter 6, Mishnah number 3. I'll read Mishnah number 3. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Mitnadev Adam Asham Toli B'chol Yom, Uv'chol Sha'ah Sheyirtzeh, Hu Nikra Asham Chasidim. Rabbi Eliezer says, the asham Tolui can be brought as a voluntary offering. See, a korban chatat, a korban asham, those are not voluntary offerings. You can't just say, I want to bring a sin offering into the temple, korban chatat, or an asham. Only if, in fact, you're guilty. Only if you're liable to bring it. You can't, normally speaking, volunteer those kinds of sacrifices. You can volunteer to bring a korban olah, burnt offering. You can volunteer to bring a shlamim. You can volunteer to bring a mincha. But you can't volunteer to bring a chatat or an asham. The asham taloi, says Rabbi Eliezer, is different because apparently it's not about a specific sin. Because if it's about situations where I'm obligated karet, well, that's unlikely. I can bring one every day. In fact, the Mishnah continues with a fellow named Bava ben Buti, Hayom mitnadev asham tolui b'chol yom. Chutz me'achar yom ha'kippurim yom echad. This fellow would bring a asham tolui every day, except the day after Yom Kippur. So we'll get to Yom Kippur later, maybe next time. But Rabbi Eliezer seems to be saying something different about Nasham Talui. It sounds like the very fact that I might have sinned, and perhaps he goes beyond might have sinned. It sounds like almost like in a state of sin. He says it's not about a particular sin, it's about a certain amount of guilt that one bears, and that therefore you can bring this offering every day, and this is called asham chasidim. This is the asham of the pious ones, of the chasidim. Chasidim are those very concerned about sin, always wanting to distance themselves and others from sin. So we have in this Mishnah 3 interesting opinions about asham talui. Says Rabbi Meir, if the designation was done by mistake, then we have the general principle of ta'ut. If something is done by mistake, a mekach ta'ut. I buy something thinking it's X and it's not X. The sale is not valid. I didn't get what I paid for. I got something different. It was just a mistake. Mekach ta'ut. Ta'ut is in many areas. In marriage and divorce and sales, ta'ut appears in many, many situations. Says Rabbi Meir, this was a designation by mistake. And therefore, it was never, the sanctity, the kedusha, the hekdesh, never took place. The opinion of the Chachamim, though, was different. The Chachamim was saying, it sounds like, the very fact that I might have been guilty. It's not a normal case of safek in that sense. It's the very doubt. It's the very fact that I might have been guilty. That obligates me to bring the sacrifice. True. Now I find out I was not guilty, so I don't actually bring the sacrifice. But at the time of designation, that was not clear. And therefore, the sacrifice takes effect. Once it takes effect, the only thing you can do is to wait till it gets a blemish, a mum, and redeem it. Rabbi Eliezer seems to go way beyond that, because he holds mitnadev adam. It's not mitnadev. You can't, normally speaking, volunteer a sacrifice that's obligatory sacrifice. Korban chatat cannot be volunteered. Asham toli is different, says Rabbi Eliezer. Mitnadev adam. Sounds to me like my best understanding of it is it's not about a particular sin. It's about being in a state of guilt. And that actually is related, I think, to a very interesting discussion in the Mishnah in chapter 6. And I'll take this want to make this last point. The next time we'll get back to we'll start with the Shifcha next time. and then with another basic concern of Tractate Keritot. The Mishnah says the following. The Mishnah says, Mishnah David, chapter 6, Mishnah number 4. Chayove chataot vashamot vadoin. Shovar alehen yom kippurim. Chayavim lahavi lachar yom kippurim. Chayove ashamot tuyin pturim. Says the Mishnah, fascinating halacha. If someone inadvertently sins in a situation of a korban chatat, in a situation of asham, an asham, remember, chatat is the general principle. Whenever, had you done it intentionally, there's a chiyuv karet, so inadvertent, you bring a chatat. The asham is limited to 3 particular sins, 3 particular situations, or there's a 4th as well, but a grand total of 5. The Mitzorah has the Nazir has an asham, Nazir shenitma, but it's very specific. Chatat is general. Says the Mishnah, if someone was obligated to bring someone sinned and did not yet bring the sacrifice, and Yom Kippur came. Okay, after Yom Kippur, they bring the korban chatat or the korban asham. However, says the Mishnah, that's true of a regular asham. However, chayave ashamot tuyin pturim. If someone was obligated to bring a asham talui, not sure that they sinned, and that was a week before Yom Kippur, they haven't gotten around to designating the sacrifice. Yom Kippur comes. Says the Mishnah, they are exempt. Yom Kippur exempts you from an asham talui. And that is very, very interesting idea. And by the way, that's, of course, it's not true. That's not true of a regular asham or a regular chatat. So this idea that Yom Kippur actually exempts you from the asham talui. The idea of the asham talui is a kind of provisional protection. It's what it sounds like. It puts me in a better place, in a space where I'm not to be found guilty for what I did. It's provisional atonement of sorts, and the Mishnah says, in fact, that Yom Kippur offers you the same protection. Now, if in fact you were chayav a chatat, Yom Kippur does not exempt you from an obligation. Chayavei chataot vashamot shavar lehen Yom Kippurim chayavin lahavi. There you have to bring the sacrifice, but the asham talui, the asham in a state of doubt. And you see, by the way, in particular, according to the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, says Bava ben Buti. Bava ben Buti brought an asham talui every day, except the day after Yom Kippur. He said, even after Yom Kippur, I would bring the sacrifice, but the Chachamim said no, you can't do that. Not the day after Yom Kippur. The Chachamim, by the way, the Chachamim omrim ein meviin asham talui el al davar she'dono karet l'shigilo chatat. So the Chachamim said at the end of Mishnah number 3, said you can't just bring it, you can't volunteer to bring an asham talui against Rabbi Eliezer. However, Mishnah number 4, which says that Yom Kippur actually exempts one from an asham talui, does seem to be true, even according to the opinion of the Chachamim. It's not limited, it would appear, to the view of Rabbi Eliezer. So even if one thinks that the asham talui can't be volunteered, but rather it's a specific situation where I might have violated something that is, for example, a chiyuv karet, but they agree that this kind of provisional safeguarding, this provisional atonement, let's call it that Yom Kippur does provide that. And we'll stop at this point. I wanted to come back next time to a case of asham, which is not actually mentioned in chapter 5 of Vayikra, with the other asham sacrifices. Chapter 4 is chatat, chapter 5 is chatat, asham, etc. But mentioned later in the book of Vayikra, which the Mishnah seems to have a particular interest, and I wanted to focus on that for next time, and to hypothesize or to think together with you as to why the Mishnah seems so interested in that particular case. And then there's one other general issue that appears in many of the mishnayot in Masechet Keritot, and we'll stop at that point. Once again, this is just highlighting some of the mishnayot in Masechet Keritot. For those who are doing the Mishnah Yomit, of course, you're doing all the mishnayot. But I did want to try to focus on what I think is central to the tractate. Thank you very much, and look forward to meeting with you next time.